Well, now the title of this message this morning in Luke chapter 16 is One Shrewd Dude. One shrewd dude. Because in this passage this morning, we meet a guy who in many ways, quite frankly, can be described as just absolutely ruthless, absolutely cold-blooded and cold-hearted. I mean, this is a guy who's driven to protect his own personal interest. And so this morning we see that he very shrewdly manipulates circumstances and manipulates people and manipulates his finances for his own personal gain. And so in many ways, he's kind of the ancient version of Omarosa. I don't know if you remember Omarosa, but with Donald Trump running for president these days, how many of you remember the show Celebrity Apprentice? If you do, no doubt you remember Omarosa, because after all, she was nicknamed the woman America loves to hate. The woman America loves to hate. And although most people say that they can't stand her and they can't stand to even look at her, nevertheless, they couldn't take their eyes off of her during the time that she was on the show because she single-handedly drove the ratings of that show. But in the end, of course, Trump has no choice but to turn to her and say, "You're fired." In fact, she was on the show more than once. And so 2 or 3 times he turns and tells her, "You're fired." But before us this morning, this is sort of the male version of Omarosa, because this is the guy that everyone loved to hate. And yet Jesus this morning takes this guy's bad example and he tells us that there's something he wants his church to learn from it. He wants his church to learn from this example. And so it's very, very important this morning that we notice right away in verse 1 that it says that he said these things to his disciples. To his disciples. He's saying these things to us, to those of us who would call themselves followers of Christ, to those of us who would call themselves Christians. This is a message for his church. And so now with that, let's go back and meet this guy in the story. And again, as we look at the first 7 verses, indeed, we're going to see that this is a guy who's basically an unscrupulous executive. Again, verse 1, it says, "And he said these things to his disciples and said, 'There's a certain rich man who had a steward, and an accusation was brought to him that this man was wasting his goods. So he called him and said to him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your stewardship, for you can no longer be steward." For the steward then said within himself, "What shall I do? For my master is taking the stewardship away from me. I cannot dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I've resolved what to do. When I'm put out of the stewardship, that they may receive me into their houses." So he called every one of his master's debtors to him, and he said to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" And he said, 100 measures of oil. And so he said to him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. And then he said to another, "How much do you owe?" And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And so he said to him, "Take your bill and write 80. Now, as we read about this guy, in some ways, as we look at how this guy's dealing with things, and unscrupulous and immoral this guy is, he kind of reminds me of another unscrupulous executive. Bernie Madoff. How many of you remember Bernie Madoff? Just a few years back, 2008, 2009, remember his so-called Ponzi scheme? Madoff, back then, they say that he committed the largest financial fraud in U.S. history. It's estimated that he actually stole somewhere around $65 billion. $65 billion, the largest fraud in U.S. history. And so in 2009, he was then sentenced to spend 150 years in prison for his crime. Now, with that, at his firm, he also had a couple of his sons working for him. And so one of his sons, Peter, ended up being sentenced for 10 years. And then another one of his sons, Mark, couldn't handle the pressure of all this and ended up hanging himself and committing suicide. Now, most of Madoff's victims were charity organizations and the elderly and even some Jewish people. Now, keep in mind, Bernie Madoff himself was Jewish. And so, in effect, he was ripping off his own people. And yet, the betrayal that's before us this morning in Luke chapter 16 may not be on the level of Bernie Madoff. It may not be 65 billion worth of theft, but at the same time, this is quite a story. And so what we have here is a story of a wealthy business tycoon who had working for him a man who was called a steward. A steward. Now, basically, a steward is somebody who would be managing your resources, managing your accounts, managing your finances for you. You see, it was common in those days for wealthy business owners like this guy to have a slave with proven administrative skills, a slave with proven business skills to manage their financial resources for them. In fact, we see the same sort of thing all the way back in Genesis chapter 39. Remember the story of Joseph? Remember how Joseph was sold into slavery by his own brothers. And as he's sold into slavery, there was an Egyptian commander by the name of Potiphar who purchased him, brought him into his house. But when he discovered that Joseph had incredible business acumen, he promoted Joseph to the position of steward, managing his resources for him. And so that's basically what we have in this story before us this morning. And now in this parable, however, this is a guy who basically is the CFO, the chief financial officer of this guy's organization, who as it's discovered, had been less than honest in his business dealings. He was pilfering. He was dipping his hands into the proceeds, so to say, and now it's been discovered. And so now he's brought in, and he has to give an account for all of the resources, the finances that he'd been given responsibility over. And so basically, his boss is about to go all Donald Trump on him and say, "You're fired." That's about what's to happen. But this steward diligently and even shrewdly, as the text tells us, shrewdly goes to all of the debtors who owed his boss money and negotiates a settlement with each and every one of them. He negotiates a settlement, and he's able to get something on behalf of his boss. He figures, something is better than nothing. And so he goes and he works out these deals. But you see, in this particular case, this wasn't just a guy, a CFO who's been terminated, a money manager who's been fired. But more than that, this is a guy who's also been evicted. He's not only been fired from his job, but evicted from his home. Because keep in mind, as a steward, this guy not only worked for this man's company, but he also lived in this man's house. He was his slave. He was his slave. And so he's about to be unemployed and out of a place to live. And so now all of a sudden this guy thinks, man, what am I going to do? I mean, I'm about to be jobless and homeless. And I'm a number cruncher. I can't get out there and do construction. I can't do physical labor. And quite frankly, I'm too proud to beg. I'm too proud to stand on a street corner with a cardboard sign that says, "We'll work for food." We'll file tax returns for sandwiches. I can't do that. And so as a last-ditch effort, he thinks, you know what? I know what I'll do. I'll go out in my master's name and I'll negotiate settlements with each and every one of those who owe my master money. I'll basically get out there and do my best Howie Mondale impersonation and say, hey, who wants to play deal or no deal? And he gets out there and he comes up to the first guy and he says, how much do you owe my boss? And the guy tells him, well, I owe this much. He says, great, write a check for half of that and we'll call it good. He goes to the next guy and he says, how much do you owe my boss? And he tells him the amount, and he says, great, write a check for 80% of that, and we'll call it good. Now, really, what's happening here is that really this guy is killing two birds with one stone. Two birds with one stone. Because not only is this guy getting something on behalf of his boss, but more than that, in the process, he was really sort of interviewing for a job. He was getting something for his boss, but at the same time, he was kind of interviewing for a job with these clients who owed his boss money. He's hoping that when they see how good of a deal he's giving them, and when they see how hard he works and how creative he is to come up with these deals, that they might be thinking, you know what? I could use a guy like you on my payroll. I could use a guy like you in my organization. And so this is why, as we pick it up now in verse 8, we see indeed that this unscrupulous executive was really one shrewd dude. And so in verse 8, Jesus goes on and he says, and so the master commended the unjust steward. No, stop there. Now just let those words sink in for just a minute. When you consider just how ruthless how unscrupulous, how dishonest this guy was? And yet, in spite of all of that, it says that the master commended him. Jesus says in verse 8, so the master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. And then Jesus says, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. And then he says in verse 9, and I say to you, make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home. So, indeed, this is a story with a lot of surprising twists and turns in it. I mean, because you would have expected that a guy like this, at the very, very least, would have been canned for what he just did. He would have been fired for what he just did. If not, even locked up and thrown into prison, right? I mean, after all, Martha Stewart, the diva of decorating. I mean, even Martha Stewart had to spend 15 months in a federal penitentiary for her role in insider trading. Anybody else remember the whole Cologne scandal that she was a part of? And so even Martha Stewart was locked up. Now, of course, we know she had the best decorated prison cell ever. Let me just show you what to do with these bars. If you take your toothpaste tube, just like so, just probably the greatest cell you've ever seen in your life. But even she was locked up, right? And so at a minimum, that's what we would have expected, that this guy would at least have lost his job, if not even been locked up, right? Now listen to this. In that day, in those days, typically a slave who's been entrusted with his master's resources, a slave who's been entrusted with the position as CFO, Chief Financial Officer, and then all of a sudden it's discovered that he's been embezzling funds, that he's been mishandling funds. I mean, at a minimum, in those days, the master of that slave had the absolute right to execute that slave right on the spot. Just kill him and execute him for what he did. That was the master's right. And at a minimum, it would have been, just extremely merciful for the master of the servant just to have this guy arrested and locked up to spend the rest of his life in prison. And so at a minimum, that's what we'd expect, that he would have been locked up. He would have been in a jail cell, if not even executed and put to death for what he's done, which is why verse 8 is so surprising. Look at it again. In fact, let me read verse 8 for you, this time out of the New International Version. Jesus, in verse 8, in the New International Version says, the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly, for the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of light. And so what we have here is a contrast. We have a contrast between the people of the world versus the people of light. We have a contrast between unbelievers versus believers. We have a contrast between non-Christians versus Christians. And Jesus is saying, you know what? In the world, people that don't know Christ, non-Christians, are more shrewd than people who know Christ, than Christians are. But then, in verse 9, then Jesus goes on to give the application of all this. He goes on to tell them this is the whole reason he's telling them this parable. And look at verse 9. And again, let me read this out of the New International Version. Jesus, he says, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it's gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. And so Jesus says, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself. And so Jesus is saying, you know what? This is the whole reason I'm sharing this story with you. Here's the purpose of this parable. He's saying that you would use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself. Now, he's not saying that the purpose of this parable is that you would be a dishonest businessman. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, you know what? That you as his follower would be just as shrewd for his kingdom. If people in this kingdom, people in the world can be shrewd, then we should be just as shrewd for his kingdom as well. Now listen, at the same time, let me be very, very clear. This guy is not being praised for his lack of integrity. this guy is not being praised for his dishonesty. No, I mean, this guy, it's clear. This was a dirty, rotten scoundrel. Nothing but a two-bit thief. But at the same time, in his desperation, he realizes, he's like, you know what? I've got to make friends, and I've got to make friends quickly. And so it's like he steals a page out of Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And those of you that are in business, maybe you even had to read that book. And when you think about it, I mean, this sort of thing happens in business all the time, right? In fact, in the business world, in the corporate world, I mean, corporations even have entire budgets set aside just for this very thing, right? Have budgets set aside to help you win friends. Corporations have budgets set aside so that you could take your clients out to lunch, so that you can take your clients golfing, or put on these trade shows, or to buy them tickets for the big game, or for these concerts, or whatever it is. All these different promotions. Now, sometimes we call it networking. Sometimes we call it making connections. Sometimes we just call it what it really is: schmoozing. But it's using worldly wealth, or in this case, the corporate's wealth, to win friends, to influence people. And so here's what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, you know what? If you have no problem winning friends and influencing people in order to close that sale, if you have absolutely no problem making connections in order to get the deal done, then why is it so hard for you to do that for his kingdom, to do that for the kingdom of God? I mean, listen, some of us are so afraid of evangelism. Some of us are so afraid of talking about Jesus and reaching out for Jesus and bringing people to Jesus, and yet we do the same thing for the world. We do the same thing for our corporation. We win friends and we influence people. And we have no problem with it. And so Jesus is saying, you know what? Then why is it so hard for you to win friends and influence people for Jesus, for his kingdom? Listen to this. The Bible says in Proverbs 11, verse 30, he who wins souls is wise. Not he who closes deals, not he who gets the most sales. He who wins souls is wise. And so Jesus is saying, the purpose of this parable is not so that you would be a dishonest businessman, but rather it's to illustrate that if they can be this shrewd for their sake, then why can't you be shrewd for his sake? For his sake. And so now as we pick it up in verse 10, we see that it's not really about how much you have, but rather it's about how you use what you have. How you use what you have. Verse 10, Jesus says, he who's faithful in least shall be faithful in much, but he who's unjust in least is also unjust in much. Therefore, if you've been unfaithful in unrighteous mammon, who will commit to you your trust with the true riches? And if you have been faithful, if you have not been faithful in what is another man's, who will give you what is your own? Now, over and over again, now Jesus uses the word mammon. He talks about unrighteous mammon versus righteous mammon. Now, you need to know that this word mammon is really an old Aramaic word that just means money. So we might read a verse like this, and we might think, wait a minute. Is Jesus saying that we should use our money to bribe people to be our friends? Is Jesus saying that we should use our money to buy friends? No, not at all. Listen, that's the way the world works. That's the way of the world. Listen, that's how it works in the world, right? I mean, in the world, people use their money to influence friends and to buy friends, right? I mean, in the world, they buy another round of drinks for everybody, or they buy the entertainment, or they pay for this, but they're winning people. They're buying friends. No, but that's not what Jesus is saying for us to do. But what he is saying is simply this: why not use your money to win people to Christ? Why not use your money to influence people to Christ? Rather than pile it up for yourself, why not spread it around for his kingdom? Instead of using it for personal gain, why not use it for his gain? You see, we need to realize that money, or as the Bible calls it, wealth, influences those around us, doesn't it? The Bible says in Proverbs 19, verse 4, wealth makes many friends. But the question is, are they real friends? I mean, listen, anybody who has a little bit of money knows that if you've got some money, you have no problem finding friends. I mean, when you've got some money, people come out of the woodwork wanting to be your friends, right? But are they real friends? Because one saying says, money draws flies. And so the Bible says in Proverbs 19, wealth makes many friends, but the poor is separated from his friend. And then it goes down later on in verse 6 to say, many entreat the favor of nobility, and every man is a friend to one who gives gifts. You see, the Bible's saying that this is how it works in the world. In the world, if you've got money, you have no problem finding friends. In fact, if you've got money, you can use your friends to influence people. You can give gifts. You can give tickets. You can buy drinks. You can pay for vacations. You can schmooze. You can influence people with your wealth. They come out of the woodwork. As one guy who won the Powerball fairly recently put it, he says, when you get more money, you also get more parasites. Money management consultants, tax advisors, lawyers, and sponging relatives. You have no problem with people coming out of the woodwork. And so we have a choice. Are we going to do it the world's way, or are we going to do it God's way? Are we going to live in this kingdom, or are we living for his kingdom? Are we going to pile it up for ourselves, or are we going to spread it out for him? And so it's not about how much we have, rather it's about how we use what we have. And so now the question, as we come to the last verse of this morning, as in this parable that's often called the parable of the unjust steward, or as we nicknamed him, one shrewd dude. The question for each and every one of us, myself included, the question for all of us this morning is what about you? Are you a shrewd dude or dudette? I make sure everybody's covered. Dudes and dudettes alike. Verse 13, Jesus says, no servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and mammon. Now, it's interesting, this word serve. He says, you cannot serve two masters. And then he says, you cannot serve both God and mammon. Now the word serve is very interesting. You need to understand that in those days, there were basically a couple of different types of servants. There were those who served out of obligation because they had to, and then there were those who served out of love because they wanted to. Now, the original language that Jesus told this parable in seems to imply that the servant here, in question in this story, was serving out of love. Serving out of love. You see, it's the difference between doing something for your iron-fisted boss, your slave driver at work, versus doing something for your kids or doing something for your spouse. It's the difference between doing something because you have to versus doing something because you want to. One's out of love and the other is out of obligation. And so Jesus this morning, when he says you cannot serve God and money, the implication is that it's a matter of love. Which one do you love? Do you love God or do you love money? Now listen, the Bible says in Ecclesiastes 5:10, whoever loves money never has money enough. Whoever loves money never has money enough. How many of you know that to be true? I mean, haven't you ever been in a place in your life and you think, man, if I could just have more money, I would be happy, but you're never happy? Or you think, man, if I could just win the lottery, if I could just hit the Powerball, all my problems would go away. I mean, I'd finally have enough money, only to discover that enough is never enough. That's what the rapper Bow Wow discovered. Don't laugh, that's his name. Years back, he discovered that was the truth. After he made over $50 million in his music career, he came to this conclusion. He said, you know what? I found out the hard way that you can have everything in the world and still not be satisfied. Whoever loves money never has money enough. And so basically this morning in this parable, Jesus is telling us that there's two kinds of people in this world. There are those who serve the Almighty God, and there are those who serve the almighty dollar. But, as Henry Fielding warned, make money your God, and it'll plague you like the devil. So you have to be careful. In fact, on one occasion, somebody asked the Bible teacher, Warren Wiersbe, they said, Pastor Wiersbe, how can I tell if money is my master or if God is my master? And Warren Wiersbe answered, and he said, well, it's easy. He said, whichever one you serve, that's your master. He said, if you spend all of your time and all your energy trying to get more money, or if all your thoughts are always consumed by how much you need, or if you always wish that you had more, then you know what? That's your master. Now listen, as I say that, let me make it clear that this morning's message is not a message on tithing. It's not a message on giving. I say that because right about now, some of the visitors might be like, Martha, they're talking about money. The preacher's winding up. The bucket's coming. Get the kids. Let's get out of here. This is not a message on tithing, but rather this is a message about stewardship, about management. Because here's what I believe. I believe that each and every one of us, as his stewards, as his servants, just like the servant in this story this morning, each and every one of us is going to one day stand before our master and have to give an account. Have to give an account of how we use the resources that he provided for us. Were we shrewd? Were we creative? Because listen, in the end, the account that we're going to give is not how much did we make. The account that we're going to give is not how much did we pile up for ourselves and for our families. No, the account that we're going to give is simply this. How well did we use the world's resources to reach the people of this world for his kingdom? How well did we use this world's resources to reach the people of this world for his kingdom? So now it's with that I want to give you an example of something that we're doing as a church. In fact, really, it's an invitation. It's an opportunity for you to get in on the ground floor, so to say. An opportunity to be a part of being a shrewd steward. We've been telling you that later in the fall we have this outreach coming up in September 11th. We're going to show the movie The Neighborhood. And some of you have already seen this movie, but it's a movie about four guys, David Zamora, Tommy Cota, David Trujillo, and Jose Hernandez. And each of these guys grew up in East LA, and they grew up in gangs. But then each and every one of them had a personal encounter with Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ changed their lives. And now each and every one of them today are pastors of their own Calvary Chapel-style churches. Now, I first saw this movie about a year or so ago at the Senior Pastors Conference in Southern California. And when I saw this movie, I thought, you know what? We have got to show this movie. Now, obviously, in our church, we don't have tons and tons of gangbangers in our church. But at the same time, we are right in the middle of it. We are in the heart of downtown Brighton. We are right here in the thick of it. There's gang activity, the Serenos and all kinds of different stuff right here where we are. We are in the thick of it. And I thought, it just makes absolute sense that we take advantage of this and use this movie. But then I thought, well, how are we going to draw the right crowd? How are we going to, as the parable put it, win friends? Influence the right people, bring the right people. And so I came up with this idea. Now this was just my rough draft, not my final copy, just my rough draft. My rough draft idea was to have a lowrider car show as the thing that would draw a crowd to this area. Just have that parking lot over there, just filled with lowriders, and we could bring in taco trucks and all kinds of stuff, and use that to draw the right crowd, and then get those people in here to watch this movie. And so then, several months ago, we had a planning meeting for that. We shared that vision. Now, at that planning meeting, we talked about this, and we said, we would even have door prizes, like maybe give away TVs and different things like that. Well, at the end of the meeting, both David Kronk and Brad Argood came up with this great idea for a better door prize. And their idea is, instead of giving away TVs, Brad Argood does auto body restoration. And so they thought, what if we buy kind of a beater up car, a fixer upper, and then Brad could, make it look like a lowrider, and maybe we don't have the budget to, get it all decked out, with the hydraulics and the whole thing, but at least it would look good, and we could say, you could win this car. We thought, oh man, that's cool, and so we started planning with that. Well, later, I was talking with my friend Adam Gomez. Now, Adam is one of the teaching pastors now over at my old home church, Crossroads. But Adam, he is a former gang member himself. And so Adam and I were talking, and we're like, you know what? How are we going to get the people out of that parking lot where the car show is and get them into here? And we thought, we can't do it. And then we came up with a new idea. Now, here's our final draft. And so we decided, you know what, we're going to scrap the lowrider car show altogether, no longer show have a lowrider car show at all, and instead what we're going to do is just say, hey, you know what, come to our church on a certain day and watch this movie, and you might win this lowrider. And so we thought, cool. So we started, searching Craigslist and started looking for all these different things, trying to find the right car. And we budgeted about $5,000. We figured, if we spent about $2,500 on a fixer-upper car, maybe another $2,500 to fix it up, $5,000, we might be able to pull this off. And so I'm looking, and I'm looking, and I'm looking. That was our plan, but as it turns out, God had different plans. As it turns out, we were looking for a fixer-upper, but let me show you what God gave us. Go ahead and put that picture up. Not that one, the other one. That's the one. So this is what God gave us. Now, this is not a fixer-upper. This is an actual show car. It's called One Bad Beamer. This is a car that's been featured in Lowrider magazine. It's a car that last year at the Budweiser Super Show at the Denver Coliseum took second place in the car show there. And this is a car that in that culture is very, very well known. And God hooked us up with this car. We were able to buy this finished show car, not a fixer-upper. I mean, this has got the hydraulics. It's got everything. It is just. I mean, this thing is choloed out. I mean, it is ready to go. And we were able to get this thing for $5,000. But we thought we'd get a fixer-upper. God gave us a show car. And so now we're telling people, you know what? You come here on September 11th, you watch this movie, you might win that car. And so that's the plan. But listen, our goal is not to give away a car. In fact, our goal is not even to show a movie. No, listen, our goal is to reach the lost for Christ, right? I mean, our goal is just to be shrewd stewards. Shrewd stewards who are using the world's resources, or as Jesus called it, unrighteous mammon, for his kingdom, to win friends, that is, to win souls for Christ. So we're using the things of this world to reach the people of this world, trying to be, shrewd stewards for his kingdom. Now, at the same time, some of you might be like, yeah, but you know what? I mean, I wasn't a gangbanger. I didn't roll like that. I didn't grow up in that kind of a culture. I don't know if I can relate to people like that. I don't know if I've got anything to offer people like that. I just politely disagree. And here's why. Listen, it's true, you might not have been a gangbanger, but you know what? You were a sinner saved by grace. You are a sinner who is forgiven by Jesus Christ. You are a sinner who is transformed by the blood of Jesus Christ. And I'm here to tell you, that transcends everything. That transcends everything. Because quite frankly, you may not have their background, but they want your future. They want what you have. You have something to offer. And so even though you don't come from where they come from, you do have something that you can offer. The Lord can use you in this outreach. Let me share with you my life verse. And, everybody's kind of got their life verse. And for me, as you know, I grew up in different foster homes and lived in all kinds of different neighborhoods and lived in barrios and in ghettos and all these different things. And I had to be like a chameleon and adapt and kind of become whatever, group of people I was hanging out with. And then as a Christian, I found this verse. And this is really kind of my life verse. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll kind of paraphrase it. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 20, the Apostle Paul says, to the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those who were under the law, I became like one under the law, so as to win those who were under the law. And then down in verse 22, he says, to the weak, I became weak to win the weak. He says, I've become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. And listen, that's what we do. And so what that means is to the Starbucks barista, I become a Starbucks drinker, that I might reach the Starbucks addict. To the skater, you become a skater. Now, I didn't learn how to skate, but if you remember back in 2010, we did a really big skateboard outreach over at the skate park on Bromley Lane. We reached thousands of teenagers that were there on that day. And now, today, in 2016, to the gangsta, we're becoming gangsters. That doesn't mean you got to get your grill on, but you might have to learn some phrases like orale. Orale, pues ese. No, ways out. I'm just kidding. Some of you have no idea what I just said. Just get the Urban Dictionary later and you'll find out. But what we're saying is that God can use you. And if you just put yourself and make yourself available, you have something to offer. But every one of us, we need to be shrewd. We need to be creative. That's the question for us. Are you a shrewd dude or dudette? Now, there's one last question I have for you, and it's simply this. We talked about this car. Well, let me ask you, you want to see the car? I don't mean a picture of the car. I mean, you want to actually see the car. Well, if you do, here's what's going to happen. Stay right where you are for just a minute. Let me get to that door over there. And when I get to that door over there, then you come out, meet me outside, and I will show you the one bad Beamer.